Ladies and gentlemen, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was the odd man out among the warlords of the Second World War. All the others had seen military service during the First World War in one form or another. Roosevelt was totally civilian. During the First World War, he was Assistant Secretary to the Navy, but this was a political appointment. Incidentally, it always made him regard the Navy thereafter as his special service. During the Second World War, General Marshall once asked him not to refer to the Navy as us and the American Army as them. He was also the only one, in a way, he was totally political. There is nothing interesting about Roosevelt except that he was a completely political person. Then again, if you look at the others, they had other interests. All of them, in fact, wrote books of different kinds. Stalin's, incidentally, very boring. Roosevelt never wrote anything except rather casual private letters. He didn't even write his own speeches. He had an army of speechwriters laboring for him, though it's fair to say that some of the finest phrases, such as "we have nothing to fear except fear itself," were inserted by Roosevelt at the last moment. And most of all, perhaps, his destiny, his background, did not prepare him at all to be a warlord. In theory, of course, he was a warlord from the time that he became President of the United States, elected in 1932, taking office in 1933. By the Constitution, the President is always the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. But in 1933, when Roosevelt first became President, he was far from thinking in warlike terms. In those days, he had to save his country from a tremendous economic crisis, perhaps the worst crisis that any modern country has ever faced. The day that Roosevelt became president, all the banks in the United States closed their doors, as though the whole country was indeed bankrupt. And it was the force of his personality, his improvisations, his readiness to pursue any kind of contradictory policy in order to restore confidence, which began the New Deal and, in fact, lifted the United States up from the Great Depression. Roosevelt had no preconceived ideas about economics, or for that matter, about war. I'm almost tempted to say that he had no principles. I don't mean by that that he was wicked, but that he operated in purely responses to the situation and became determined only at the very last minute. There's a story from the early days of the New Deal when the dollar had gone off gold, and two economists came to see him. One of them with a paper advising that the dollar should go back on gold. The other advising, quite the contrary, that it should be allowed to float and to depreciate. And Roosevelt looked them over and said, look, take these two papers into the next room and mix them together. And this was what he always did with people who came with contradictory arguments, advices. Go away and mix them together. Again, somebody said of him, people make a great mistake when the president says yes, they think that means he agrees with them. It only means, well, I've heard what you say, and I'm not going to make up my mind now. Again and again, with people in the United States, with foreign statesmen, Roosevelt would say yes, as for instance in 1942, when Molotov came over from Russia and pleaded for a second front, the president said yes, there must be a second front this year. But he only meant this is how he felt it at the moment, and that it was a useful thing to say to Molotov. By his hesitations, he allowed situations to develop. And again, someone has described his policy as the eternal question mark. There was always a question mark. What would the president do? It was only towards the end of the 1930s that he became drawn into foreign affairs at all. Indeed, in his earlier years, he was the most isolationist of all American presidents, convinced that it was America's duty to concentrate on her own recovery and still more on her own wealth, which he put first. As the situation in Europe and in the Far East moved towards war, Roosevelt refused to be committed, always hoping that the menace, the eternal question mark of American policy would restrain the other countries from going to war. At the time of Munich, for instance, he refused to give the slightest commitment or suggestion of support to the British and French. Even in 1939, although he expressed disapproval of Hitler's policy, he was careful not to commit himself. And when we turn the question round the other way and ask the question, as it were, of Roosevelt, what did he intend? There are, I think, two absolutely conflicting answers. One given by his opponents, his enemies within the United States, and he had many, was that Roosevelt throughout was set on war, that he wanted to drag the American people into war on the side of the Western powers, then on the side of Great Britain, and that in a similar way he was set on dragging the United States into war against Japan. And people, some, in my opinion, very mistaken historians, have traced the whole series of conspiracies by which Roosevelt drew America into the war. Others, some of his associates, some of perhaps more detached historians, have taken the view that he himself did not know what he was going to do. For a long time, that is to say, from the time of the fall of France in 1940, all through the Battle of Britain, Roosevelt had doubts whether Great Britain was going to survive. His anxiety in 1940 was not to go to the aid of the British, but to ensure that in case Great Britain was invaded, the Royal Navy would be sent to the New World. Churchill always refused to give the promise because he said even to suggest it would imply that we could consider defeat, and defeat is inconceivable. But after that, Roosevelt's policy was simply to build up Great Britain, to keep Great Britain going, to maintain her independence. Until when? Until what? Until America could come into the war, or until both Great Britain and Germany wearied of war and would accept some sort of compromise. This is impossible to say. The other thing, of course, what you have to bring in, is that he, despite being president, despite being re-elected not only in 1936, but again in 1940, and ultimately in 1944, Roosevelt was very restricted by American opinion. Incidentally, to be president for 4 times made him unique. It had never happened before, and now, owing to a constitutional amendment, it can never happen again. Roosevelt was intensely apprehensive of public opinion, and according to some good judges, often dragged behind it. He certainly did not wish to lead until the situation was ripe. In 1940, for instance, it would have been difficult for Roosevelt, for the American government, to send economic aid to Great Britain. By the spring of 1941, the situation had changed. Americans were saying, all aid short of war. And this was perhaps Roosevelt's first great stroke, Lend-Lease, which ensured that Great Britain would stay in the war, sustained by American aid. But of course, there's another side to it. Still more so when Russia went into the war, that thanks to Lend-Lease, the British and the Russians did the fighting, and the Americans, the American economy made the profit. Though Roosevelt admired British courage, was anxious for British independence, he had a poor opinion of the British Empire. Curiously enough, he seems to have regarded Stalin's tyranny with a much gentler eye. In 1943, when he was at Tehran, he discussed the Indian problem with Stalin. He said, of course, Churchill's an old Tory. We can't trust him with India. The real answer, I think, would be to introduce the thorough Soviet system and make India new. So here he was, perhaps not very seriously, it was the kind of thing you would say to Stalin, but he had a deep distrust of what he called British imperialism, and talked at one time of handing Hong Kong even over to China. Certainly, he was deeply opposed to restoring the British Empire after the war. Even more hostile, of course, or distrustful of the French Empire, particularly as it had been defeated. Sometimes reading his letters, you think that he disliked General de Gaulle even more than he disliked Hitler, because de Gaulle represented an arrogant independence. The very fact that de Gaulle had nothing meant that he could behave in an independent way, whereas Churchill had to be more cooperative. Between the two men, there was a considerable element of personal friendship. But then with Roosevelt, there was always personal friendship when he needed it. He was entirely a man who lived for giving himself up. Often, he's one of those men who, when he's alone in a room, you feel he wasn't there at all. He had to have company. He was, in a sense, irresponsible. His conversation was always on the surface. He never said anything profound. He never expressed even profound views about the war. To him, apparently, the war was entirely caused by a shortage of raw materials for some of the powers. And he often said one of the ways of preventing or ending the war would be to agree on sharing the raw materials of the world out equally. Incidentally, it never occurred to him that this meant sharing out America's raw materials cheaply for other people. America was for him the privileged country. For instance, when Lend-Lease was made, part of the bargain was that the British must cut down their exports, must become totally dependent on the United States. And as Keynes said of the British, we threw good housekeeping to the wind, but we saved the world. The Americans, although they supplied the weapons of war, also squeezed Great Britain dry economically, and that was Roosevelt's deliberate policy. Did he lure Japan and the American people into war? I am confident that he did not. He made mistakes. He imposed an economic embargo on Japan, which inevitably was a delayed declaration of war, but the actual attack on Pearl Harbor was a total surprise. It was not planned by Roosevelt. Indeed, I will tell you briefly why the surprise was so complete. For some fortnight before the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese Navy had not been in wireless communication. Although the Japanese knew what they were going to do, no one else did. It's nonsense to say that there was ever a series of wireless signals which the Americans could have broken. What they knew is that Japan was going to war somewhere. And at the very last minute, when the Japanese sent a message with an ultimatum, one American code officer deduced that Pearl Harbor would be attacked because 1 o'clock, which is when the message, 1 p.m., which is when the message would be delivered in Washington, was sunrise at Pearl Harbor. He passed it to his chief, Admiral Stark of the Navy, and Stark said, but the defense of Pearl Harbor is for the Army. So it went laboriously over to General Marshall, the Army chief. Marshall was out riding. When he got back, he said, we must send them a warning, mustn't we? We're going to be attacked in an hour's time. He then found that the Army signals had stood down for the day. So he said, I'm not going to ask the Navy to send it. That would be too degrading. So he sent it by commercial lines, and the commercial line stopped at San Francisco and held the telegraph up for a quarter of an hour. Finally, it arrived at the telegraph office in Pearl Harbor. It was given to a messenger, who incidentally was a Japanese, to take up to command headquarters. And he got on his bicycle and was loyally pedaling up when the bombs began to fall. This was a surprise for everyone. It solved the problem. Roosevelt perhaps might never, Roosevelt would have had great difficulty in bringing the American people into war if it had not been for the Japanese attack and the German ultimatum that followed it. From that time, Roosevelt was commander-in-chief in practice as well as in theory. He exercised command in very different ways from either Stalin or Churchill. He certainly didn't control all the distant armies. He didn't even sit in with the chiefs of staff to any great extent. In fact, Roosevelt never liked formal meetings. What he liked was sitting around with one or two old friends, the people he could rely on, late at night, trying out this idea and that. and then arriving at decisions. This is the thing which often disturbed Churchill, disturbed the even tenor of negotiations between the British and the American chiefs of staff, that suddenly, without previous warning, without explaining why the decision had been made, the president would announce the decision. One American military historian has calculated 22 different occasions, all of great importance, when Roosevelt, without explanation, overrode all his professional advisors. The first, and a decision which shaped the course of the war for 2 years, was a decision, this time in accordance with his professional advisors, to put the European war first. After all, the United States could have chosen, and it's an amazing thing, considering Pearl Harbor, that the American people did not insist on dealing with Japan first. Roosevelt argued very simply, Germany is the greater enemy. Once we've defeated Germany, we should be able to deal with Japan. And there followed from this something else, which was his initiative much more. General Marshall, the American generals, general staff, wanted to prepare a single thing, a vast build-up of arms and then an invasion of Northern Europe. The British were already fighting in Africa. Churchill wanted the African war to be extended. Roosevelt at first indicated approval of what his military advisors were doing, and then quite suddenly came down on the other side. He accepted the British argument that you couldn't have an invasion of Northern Europe in 1942. And he said, if we can't invade Northern Europe, we must go somewhere else. And that somewhere else is not the Pacific. The decisive voice in putting the whole Allied weight into the Mediterranean campaign, first in North Africa and then in Italy, and postponing the Second Front in Northern Europe until 1944, was Roosevelt's. And why do you think he made it initially? Because the congressional elections were coming up in November 1942, and he wanted American soldiers to be actually engaged in battle before the elections. It would be a good way of swinging the vote. Ironically, they were delayed, and the Allied armies only landed in Northern Africa a week after the elections. But by then, the momentum had been given. Roosevelt did much more in determining these character of wars. I think, for one thing, he was more concerned than perhaps the American generals were to keep in step with the British, to sustain Churchill and to sustain the British spirit in the European field. He never had the slightest interest in involvement in the British Far Eastern affairs. He regarded it really as an embarrassment that they should be there at all. But he needed the British in order, I think, to be his loyal second. He had the strangest and simplest ideas of how the world should be run after the war, until quite late in the day, his solution for all post-war problems is that every country in the world except the United States would be disarmed, and that the United States would be the world policeman. And then on reflection, he decided that the British could have a cut-in too, so that the British would also be allowed to maintain a rather smaller army, and they would be policemen along with the Americans. So I'm sure that the British would not have been allowed to police their own empire. At a later stage still, when the Russians, in fact, were doing more fighting than the British and Americans combined, Roosevelt recognized that the plan wouldn't work and that Russia would maintain her great army, whether he approved of it or not. And therefore, the whole thing faded away. But it was a characteristic improvisation, something that he thought of late at night, came down the next morning and said, well, I've got it. Let the Americans run the world. That will provide peace and prosperity for everybody. He also thought, of course, that all countries should have exactly the American outlook, the American democratic system, and most of all, the American economic system, what has been well called not so much free trade as free investment. That if the American capitalists were allowed to invest all over the world without any restrictions, then this would produce a prosperous world. It would certainly have produced prosperity for the Americans. But with all this strange tangle, he was also a man of great ideals. I think he was the only man who really believed that the United Nations was the essential way forward for mankind and that it would work. In regard to war, he again took a simple, though in this sense, a very wise view, that the way to win a modern war was to have far more of anything than your opponents. When the Americans came to fight their battles in Northern Europe against the Germans, they did not achieve anything by superior strategy. They achieved something by surprise. But what they achieved was simply to win by weight. And as one American put it, for America, war meant a mass production war. You design something on the production line, you lay it on, and there it is. And by 1944, of course, Great Britain had been much overshadowed by this American power which Roosevelt had developed, always setting the targets higher than any American industrialist thought could be achieved, and achieving them. Roosevelt's greatest political stroke, in his opinion, was to establish good relations with Stalin. And again, how characteristic. When Churchill met Stalin, sometimes they rowed, sometimes they agreed, but they discussed serious problems in detail. When Roosevelt met Stalin, he was confident that his own skill at dealing with people would win Stalin over. His main stroke was not to say to Stalin, well, I recognize the frontiers of 1941, which he refused to do, but to tell Stalin, you know, Churchill and I call you Uncle Joe in private, at which Stalin, far from being amused, was extremely offended and said, is that a Western idea of a joke? Which I think he was, quite all right. But I don't think he was ever reconciled to it. Stalin must have found this strange, evasive man with his backslapping, with his easygoing talk, very mysterious person to deal with. On the other hand, there was something new and essential in this, that Roosevelt, unlike most Americans, did not regard Soviet Russia as totally divided by a barrier of principle. On the contrary, I'm inclined to say that he is the one Western statesman in either Great Britain or America or any Western European country, the one Western statesman since the Revolution who not only tried to get on really intimate terms with Soviet Russia, but believed that he could do it and largely did so. Relations between West and East were warmer in Roosevelt's time, not as people say, because he made unreasonable concessions, but because he was the only Western statesman of that age who really treated Soviet Russia as an equal. And I think towards the end of his life, he was more concerned to be on close terms with Russia than with England, simply because Russia had the power. How the situation would have developed at the end of the war, this is something we shall never know. But in all these things, Roosevelt, despite his limitations, his ignorance indeed of all kinds of things, he really didn't know a great deal. For instance, all the discussions about Germany and the future of Germany, Roosevelt would answer by saying, well, I know Germany very well. I went a bicycle tour there when I was a boy. And so at every conference, Roosevelt had to be the authority because he'd once bicycled there. Strange, odd fragments. When they discussed the frontiers of Poland, Roosevelt was quite ready to give a great deal of territory to Russia. But he also remembered there was a place called Lvov, which he'd once read about in a geography book. So he kept saying to Stalin, well, do you think Lvov could stay in Poland? Stalin must have been absolutely bewildered by this. The most delightful thing, after all, was when he explained to Stalin the real basis of the Polish problem so far as he was concerned. He said, you see, there are a lot of Polish voters in the United States, and very shortly there'll be an election in the autumn of 1944 to make me president again, so I must be soft to them. And Stalin said, now I understand it all, and maybe he did. At any rate, this strange man, the most enigmatic of the warlords, though perhaps not the greatest of them, was the most successful. It was Roosevelt who made the United States the most powerful country in the world. But now, if one looks at him again, there is about him a sort of emptiness. He died before the end of the war, although success was underway. His achievements, limited or otherwise, were repudiated, brushed aside. Incidentally, one of the things greatly affected the British position after the war. In 1942, this country gave America all its nuclear secrets. Roosevelt, in his casual way, made a personal promise that after the war, Great Britain should be allowed to share everything. The promise was not passed on to his successor and was not kept. Indeed, again and again, you felt that Roosevelt operated from day to day. After saying, for instance, that he meant American troops to run the whole world, at Yalta in January 1945, he said to Stalin, "We should be pulling our troops out in 2 years' time. You and the British will have to run it." But nevertheless, he had this enormous capacity of accepting responsibility. He was undoubtedly the boss. And now there is a strange story about his private life. 30 years before, in 1913, he had fallen in love with his secretary. He wished to marry her, have a divorce. His family insisted that this would ruin his political career. He acquiesced, the two parted. Eleanor Roosevelt never shared a room with her husband again. The secretary went off, married, and then became a widower. And almost 30 years after the two had parted, they met again. Roosevelt renewed his early love. It was all kept intensely secret. The Secret Service, in fact, and you know how powerful that is in the United States, provided all its resources in order to ensure that the president could be alleged going off to one place when in fact he was meeting his friend in another. On many occasions, for instance, he would depart in a special train for some objective, say, down in Georgia, and then it would be switched off into a siding. Another special train would draw up beside it, and the two would be able to spend a couple of days together. Occasionally, when Eleanor Roosevelt was in Europe or something like that, the Secret Service would smuggle her into the White House. And as his physique declined, Roosevelt spent more and more time in the country near the lady's house so that she could come over and visit him every day. In his last weeks, he was there entirely. In fact, for a fortnight or so, the United States was being run, or its policy was being determined, not by the president, but by General Marshall, the chief of staff. And on a morning in April, the lady was present, Roosevelt suddenly said, "I've got a dreadful headache," fell unconscious. And before a doctor was summoned, the Secret Service snatched up the lady, put her in a car, whisked her away. She never saw the president again. Later, when Mrs. Roosevelt learnt of this story, she was indignant. Roosevelt's daughter said, "But mother, father was a very lonely man."
Hidden in an unpublished family memoir, writer Joe Dunthorne discovers a disturbing wartime confession, an unsettling story revealed in the History podcast. Listen to Half-Life on BBC Sounds.